Dear Dr. Flick, I was happy to honor your invitation. I'm happy to be here today and to participate in the forum and talk about the topic you've suggested between being and what should be a collective violation of law. I'm honored and pleased to welcome the audience. I've been asked to handle a rather complex matter. The task I'm dealing with is a rather complicated one, because I will have to talk about the crisis and about the future of Europe, and I would like to ask you to help me, and maybe there will be more questions at the end of my presentation than there were before, but still, I am happy to discuss these items on the agenda. Now, I'm not a legal expert, and that's why I am hesitating and don't want to move on legal ground, so to speak. I'd rather focus on the regulatory side, but you all know that the regulatory dimension is, of course, and naturally, to be found in the legal context too. Now, we have reached a new phase of escalation with respect to the crisis in Europe, a new phase of escalation, which means that more and more EU member states need protection, need to join others under the umbrella, requires support, and after a period of economic adjustment in the past, we are beginning to realize that the democratic systems we have adopted are suffering. And then, of course, the aid granted and the support offered is reaching its limits. There is a certain adjustment fatigue. There is a certain bailing out fatigue, and as a consequence of a greater need for protection in more and more member states, there are less countries to carry an ever heavier burden. And this is certainly an aspect which needs to be seen when we talk about the crisis. But then we are also talking about the possibility of performance and the capacity of performance, because, as I said, there are less countries which are capable of helping, and we are beginning to ask too much, or at least more and more. Now, crisis management is what we need, but then we also have to see the perspectives for Europe and in Europe. And I would like to mention three aspects which are particularly interesting and important in this respect. First question, does Europe need a new integration movement? And if so, if it needs more integration, a push of integration, so to speak, which should be the direction? What are the requirements? Do we need new features, new approaches, or is this about recalling the consensus of Maastricht? The second aspect I would like to mention is the paradigm shift, which is happening. What used to be a stability community in the past is becoming a liability and debt union, i.e. there are member states of the EU which carry the burden and the risk of other Euro countries, but thus undermine their own creditworthiness. And the question is, what does this mean in terms of our monetary policy and for the value of our currency? And then, of course, we have to also consider what the transfer of debt means. And the third aspect we have to focus on is the amount of democratic control which is needed. And here we have to talk about the rights of the parliaments on the national level, but also about the degree of integration, which also implies the constitutional dimension. Now, we want to talk about what should be done. And here I would like to come back to the Maastricht concept. There are people who say that this is an incomplete and unfinished concept. Maybe. But it also includes a number of rules and regulations which have not been completely implemented in the last 10 to 12 years. And of course, Maastricht is a political project as well as the economic and the monetary union. But it has always been a project which went along with the idea of the process of integration. Actually, the Maastricht concept is the logical consequence of the European process of integration, in particular with respect to its monetary completion and the completion of the single market. So the idea of a monetary integration did not come up in the late 1980s. It's an idea which had been part of the EEC Treaty, which was made in 1957, and it's 17 governments, 17 ministers of finance and of economics, and different policies are involved here. Now, this is one aspect we have to see with respect to the Maastricht concept. It's a political concept, and there is a certain lack with respect to the state level. Actually, the Maastricht Treaty calls for a parallelism of the monetary union and the political union. However, nobody has ever clearly defined what a political union is. Nevertheless, I am convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that the Maastricht concept includes important rules and regulations and is thus a stable basis for what we need, and is thus worthwhile and should be implemented. Now, there is the soft coordination the states have agreed upon, and there are a number of tools which have been part of the Maastricht concept which have never been implemented. But there are also rules which are binding as well and which go beyond the mere coordination of economic activities. Now, there were major problems, in particular in 2003, when Germany and France, two important member states of the EU, began to have deficits in their budgets, which was the first major problem that occurred and undermined the overall approach of Maastricht and led to serious impacts in all other member states. So the first major test, the budgetary rule of the Stability and Growth Pact, which was meant to define the details of the Maastricht Treaty, was difficult to implement and had negative consequences and did not take the effect it was meant to take, which in the end meant that the rules the states had agreed upon could not be implemented or did not have the efficiency the countries had agreed upon initially. Another important basis of the economic and monetary union is the no bailout clause, which is Article 125 of the contract. Now, here we are dealing with a principle which is based on the idea of responsibility, i.e., the member states are responsible for their political action and initiatives. And this is an important, a crucial principle which was simply ignored when the countries embarked on the crisis management in the year 2010. The initial idea was to have only those countries be members of the Economic and Monetary Union which would not require financial or economic support from other countries, which would be strong and powerful enough in order to do without others. And maybe, and here I'm careful, it was a bit risky to start off with too many which have proven to not be able to comply with the criteria and principles agreed upon when Maastricht was made in the first place. So the core principle was that countries will not be liable for the debt of other countries. But I have to add, of course, that the parties involved were aware of the risk of transfer and knew that it might be necessary to have these transfer initiatives. In 1998, for example, a German initiative was launched in order to launch the third phase of the economic and monetary union, according to which financial transfers were explicitly excluded as a consequence of a membership in the monetary union. Now, this was a resolution adopted by the heads of government and state at the European Council meeting in June 1998 in Cardiff. However, it was a political resolution which is legally not binding. The initial idea, and that was what Maastricht was all about, was price stability. And this is certainly a goal which has been achieved. But then the independence of the central bank was another principle adopted in the context of Maastricht. And this goal has proven to be a reasonable one as well, and it worked well for many years. In other words, the central bank should not intervene in the case of a national crisis and should not issue bonds in order to help suffering or ailing states. Now, there is a fiscal policy aspect which has to be seen with respect to the crisis we are talking about, because there were periods in which the ECB was the only buyer on the market. And this is, of course, a situation which is difficult, because if you issue bonds in such a situation, the prices you get, or the money you get, is much less than in a situation where there is a better offer on the market, or where there are more offers on the market. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are a number of aspects we have to bear in mind when we look at the crisis and try to understand what this crisis is about. But this is not only a crisis of the public budget. It's an international crisis. The international financial crisis and the international economic crisis have to be seen. They seem to be less serious currently because of major budget deficits in many countries, and because of the deficit spending many countries have adopted, and also because of the ultra-expensive monetary policy adopted by many countries in the world. But the national economies all over the world still have major problems, and we are not near a solution at all. So we are dealing with a global crisis which has an impact on and in Europe as well. Another important aspect I would like to draw your attention to is the question whether Maastricht has failed or not. Now, what is the criterion we can use in order to answer this question? Now, I would say that Maastricht has actually never been implemented with respect to the coordination of the economic policy, with respect to the no bailout clause, with respect to cooperation in the fiscal policy field. Now, you might go and say this has not been possible because of the very regime, the very system we are dealing with, which is extremely complex, maybe too complicated for many member states, because many member states could not cope with it. But then there is another reason I would like to give, i.e., in many member states, one did not really understand what it means to be a member of a monetary union, because you don't have the nominal exchange rate anymore, which could be a monetary instrument, or which used to be a monetary instrument, and you cannot determine the interest rate on a national level exclusively anymore. So you need different adjustment mechanisms. This is an implication. So as long as there are no financial transfers, and as long as there is no transboundary movement of labor, there's only one channel of adjustment, and that's the adjustment of salaries and costs. And that's painful. It hurts, and that's something many countries have only realized at a very late point in time. I mean, it was said in the early 1990s or in the mid-1990s, so nobody could go and claim, I didn't know anything of it, or I haven't had an idea. But the countries did not consider the aspect sufficiently, and there is only one agency within the EU, which is the EU Commission, which is in charge of making sure that contracts that have been made are being honored, and the Commission failed here. There was also an idea of exercising group pressure, which hasn't worked either, because you always have potential sinners who judge current sinners in fiscal policy, which is a problem we are dealing with all the time. There was also a lack of convergence. There was a lot of creative accounting with respect to the statistics in many member states. Some were more careful, others were less careful. They just forged the statistics, but creativity was a problem here. The attempt to cope with the crisis management has shifted the paradigms after Maastricht. 3 reasons why my argument here is correct. A, the no bailout clauses and the guarantees which went along with these clauses were not applied to Greece in the right way. Now, Greece needed support, no doubt, but it would have been possible to go and say, okay, money will be made available for Greece, but Greece can't remain a member of the monetary union anymore. This would have been an example to show that a different way would have been a better one. I'd like to say that here I'm talking about the 3 fundamental mistakes which have been made in the crisis management of the crisis, in particular since the spring of 2010, that Greece would have needed a program, but not within the monetary zone. And it would have been necessary to grant a debt cut to Greece at an early stage as well. Now, this was a contravention of the bailout, of the no bailout clause. Second mistake, as I said, the European Central Bank is not entitled to buy government bonds from the secondary market, but this has happened as well. And then the third mistake would be the creation of a temporary financial stability facility, which becomes a permanent financial mechanism for countries in difficulties, which means that member states assume the liability for the debt of other countries and have major problems will have major problems when countries in debt go bankrupt or eventually opt out of the monetary union or have to leave it. Now the question is, why have these mistakes happened? Was it a lack of political will? Or what was the reason? Now, I'd like to say that it was a lack of political will, because monetary unions have always failed when the economic consequences of the monetary union were different from what was expected. And this goes for fiscal policy and other fields. And the examples I'm thinking of are the Scandinavian monetary union and others. Now, there are ways to guarantee and to implement the monetary union. You accept a dominant state, a hegemonic state, which determines the rules and would also implements the rules and make sure that they are being respected, and that's the Maastricht option. There are mutual agreements which are being made and which have to be respected as well, so that solidarity can happen. And as I said, Maastricht was the second option, and the reasons why I've mentioned before. Now, crisis management. The four elements we are seeing today with respect to the crisis and its European dimension are clear points to remind us of possible solutions. Now, in the beginning, many ad hoc decisions were taken, which were then combined in a concept like budget consolidation, and you cannot do without it. There are those who say there is too much austerity today, but remember, where does the debate come from? Austerity, that's what you find in countries which are part of an EU or IMF program, but you don't have austerity in countries which are better off and which have not even begun to save, and it's often used as an excuse so that they don't have to adopt any savings measures, but they will have to adopt savings measures nevertheless. This is also due to the fact that the former generation of politicians has created a problem the current generation of politicians has to deal with, i.e. via more taxation or via different taxes, because otherwise you won't be able to cope with the exploding state debt. The second aspect is production, i.e. the growth rate of the production potential. Look at Greece and other cases in order to understand that it's important to create more growth potential, which is actually, and anyway, a better way to go. much better than adopting new deficit spending programs. And the third approach, which is part of the combination of solutions which have been combined but ex post, so to speak. So the recovery and the recapitalization of the banking sector was the third measure. But it happened much too late, actually. One should have thought of the lost decade in Japan, for example. Recapitalization was urgent, but recapitalization had to go, or would have had to go hand in hand with the restructuring of the banking sector. I mean, you know the case of Spain, and you also know that the need for recapitalization was much greater than what the Spanish government admitted. And the fourth measure was the intensification or deepening of the institutional reforms on a supranational level, i.e. the strengthening of the Stability Pact, the introduction of a fiscal pact, new macroeconomic surveillance, and new tools like the ESM, because that's what we have learned from the rules we have had so far. And as I said, these rules we had, but they have not been implemented. Now the question is whether these four measures are sufficient, or these four approaches are sufficient in order to solve the problem in Europe and in order to strengthen the framework, the economic framework in Europe, so that more can be done. Now, further integration. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about more integration, we have to bear in mind that there has never been an agreement made in Europe concerning the question of what integration means, finality, and what objectives are being produced have never been part of a consensus. It was difficult with 17 EU members. It's even more difficult today with 27. Plus, there are political tensions within the EU, the monetary zone, and there are changing coalitions, which is another danger for the integration. And you have then coalitions like the coalition against France or against Germany, which might be a serious threat for the axis between Berlin and Paris and the European Council. Of the end of June is what I have in mind here, because for the first time the situation was completely different then. And I think people have to bear in mind that without the German-French axis or engine or basis, the whole system will fail, won't work. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what can be done in order to enhance the integration in Europe? As I said, it's important to remember the spirit and the general idea behind Maastricht. And of course, we have to bear in mind that it's key to overcome the problems and mistakes made in the past. And then we need the consolidation of the euro, which was the initial idea. And I don't want to go into detail here. I guess you know what I mean. And then, of course, we need to introduce a fiscal and a banking union in addition to the economic and the monetary union, complementary, so to speak, which would also get us closer to a federation that becomes a federal state with the respective supra-regional institutions. Now, it would be good to, first of all, go and secure the current degree of integration, which does not necessarily mean that today's members of the monetary zone will be members of the monetary zone for good and will be the eternal members of the system. And that's what I had in mind when I said consolidation. The composition of the Eurozone is not an absolute, a once and for all one, because we want to be independent in our action, and thus we cannot adopt such a system. Now, in order to secure the degree of integration we have reached already, we have to strengthen the institutional structure, and we have to enhance the democratic control of the system. The idea of a fiscal union has been in many people's minds, but many people talk about it without a clear idea of what it is, i.e. there are different ideas and associations. Some say a fiscal union gets us closer to the political union, but there is no clear definition. Some say it's a major European budget and EU taxation. Others say it's just the harmonization of the financial structures of the member states. Both would require new contracts. I made a proposal a year ago with respect to the fiscal union. I said we might introduce a European budget office, which would be based on an objective, on a neutral assessment of the national situations, so that the ministers of finance have more room to maneuver and act on an EU level. Maybe I'm too optimistic here, but I think it's important to incorporate the national level. And ideas adopted on the European level have to be implemented on the national level. The banking union. Now, this is an idea which has been welcomed by many. But the question is, what is a banking union? It's not only a centralized supervision, which might be useful too, but what about the big banks, the so-called systemically relevant banks? Would it have been possible to detect the elements that eventually triggered the crisis of the banking sector in Spain? I mean, a centralized supervisory board, would it be in charge of all financial institutions in Europe? I think that would be too much. It would be too big an institution. But it's not about the supervision of banks only. This is also about mechanisms which help solve problems when banks suffer, which requires new money, a new fund, so that you can help a bank in difficulties financial means are required, funds are required. So the question is, who pays? And this gets me to the transfer of financial funds from one country to another. And would also makes me think of the idea of a shared deposit protection within the EU, which would get us into the transfer union. There are different deposit protection systems in Europe, and in some countries there are not enough funds, and in others there are enough funds, but you cannot simply go and throw it all together and hope that it works. It wouldn't. In view of all this, I'd like to underline, nevertheless, that Europe has been able to cope with a number of problems in its crisis management. However, it has not been possible to avoid a further escalation, which is, on the one hand, due to the fact that the member states denied their problems for a long, long time. According to the system, you have a first phase in which countries normally go and say, no, we don't have problems. And then you have a second phase, and then the country says, well, yeah, we do have minor problems. But then the third phase happens, and other European countries have to intervene in order to help the country in question. And this is not the right way of dealing with a problem. And there is a second aspect we have to see. Since the financial political solutions were adopted in 2010, the intervention of the ECB and the establishment of a temporary, later permanent financing facility mechanism meant that the crisis management has become ever more expensive. In the first phase, it was not as expensive as it was in the end, and I don't want to insinuate that it would have been possible to avoid all these costs, but it also reminds us of the fact that a solution will be an expensive one. Most ideas and reforms which have been adopted were the right ones, and for the first time since the agreement on the Maastricht Treaty, we do see more integration today. For a long time, there was it wasn't clear that Maastricht was to be implemented, indeed, and it was never an either or. It was always we do it both, but this situation has changed a bit, and the integration and the consolidation are moving forward. If, however, not completely. Now, we have reached an important phase, which makes me ask what needs to be done in order to intensify the process or to deepen the process of integration, and secondly, what can be done, in particular, what can be done within the given constitutional framework. These are questions we have to discuss. Thank you.